Hello, I'm Riz Khan. Welcome to this special US election edition of the show. As votes are cast and counted across America, many millions of observers across the world are perched on the edge of their seats with the kind of nervous excitement normally associated with a season-ending episode of a must-see, top-rated TV drama. And of course, the race for the White House has been the biggest drama in the global news cycle for many months, even dwarfing coverage of major conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. And it's been played out passionately in both the mainstream and social media. Well, the result of this election will resonate across the world with geopolitical impact far beyond the domestic borders of the US. Political tremors, perhaps even earthquakes, will be felt from Michigan to Moscow, Beirut to Beijing, Tel Aviv to Tehran, and beyond. So what should the world expect from a Harris administration or a second Trump presidency? We've assembled a group of experts to answer that question with insights and perspectives on China, Ukraine, the Middle East, and America. We'll start in the US, in an area that could have a profound impact on the entire election result. Michigan is a key swing state and has the largest Arab American population in the country. So will either of the presidential candidates address their concerns? Dearborn is the first Arab-majority city in the entire United States, and for its 55,000 citizens with Arab roots, a death toll of 42,000 Palestinians in Gaza looms large on the ballot. Nearby, the mayor of the city of Dearborn Heights, Bill Bazzi, made his choice. He endorsed Donald Trump. Mayor Bazzi, welcome to the show. Now, the city of Dearborn Heights is a special place in terms of its community. Tell me a little bit about it.
Right now, we're probably about, it's a good city. It's a diverse city. We have, it's pretty diverse with, Arab Americans, and we have a lot of Europeans, Italians, Polish, Macedonians. We have Hispanic, African Americans in the city. So it's pretty diverse. It's a good city. It's prospering, and there's a lot of things, a lot of great things happening here. So I'm proud, honored to be the mayor of this city.
Why has it become such a significant place in this US election?
Well, for the last 4 years, that I served in the military. I served 21 years in the U.S. Marines, and I'm always about trying to do the right thing, for first, our country. I sworn in several times to defend the Constitution of the United States, foreign and domestic. And when this election is very critical election for not just for the United States, but for the world. And for the last 4 years or so under the current administration, we've seen nothing but nothing good. Everything we're seeing is not good for this country or for the world.
How have the people in the area responded to having the spotlight shone on them so directly?
Like everything, I always say, if you can't please everybody, and if you try to please everybody, you don't please anybody. And a lot of I'm getting a lot of great feedback. A lot of people came up to me. They said they're proud that I made that decision. We're putting the city in good spotlight, just to show that, hey, we will speak. We will voice our opinion. We will voice our thoughts, and that's some of the feedbacks that I'm getting. And I'm getting a lot of great feedbacks that not just for the decision that I decided to endorse President Trump, but also that have a community leader that actually speaks out and just say that what a lot of my constituents are feeling.
Now, during an election campaign that's been so divisive at a national level, how hard has it been to maintain unity among the population?
Well, it's pretty hard right now. This is one of the most critical time in our history, not just, for this country, the world, but also for our city, because a lot of you have few people are divided. They want to go Green Party. A few people want to go with the current administration. But I think once this election is over, we all need to work together. Try to bring the community back together.
I'm going to ask you to consider what we might expect from a presidency from each of the candidates. Let's start with Kamala Harris, and I want your perspective on what a Kamala Harris presidency might bring to the people of Dearborn Heights.
Well, I am definitely not comfortable with VP Harris at this point, because she's an extension of the Biden administration. We haven't seen anything from her that she has done anything for this country or even our city. I did send a letter to the Biden administration, a couple of years ago. So I had some issues in my city, and I didn't get anything, no response, not even a letter back. That's the same administration, and that was very disappointing to me. And also I seen the chaos going on in the Middle East, in the world with the war, and she's just an extension of the current administration. And I don't feel that she's going to do anything for us. The economy is bad. It's affecting my city. I talked to a lot of people who are unemployed, and the cost of living is high, and it does affect a lot of people in my city.
So then, what would you expect from a second term of a Donald Trump presidency?
Well, President Trump actually, so when he was the president, our economy was much better. It was prospering. The cost of living was much lower. And, the most important part, the peace. And we need stability. When you don't have stability anywhere, especially in the United States, you don't, the whole world is looking at us. They're looking at our leadership, and they want a good commander in chief. And I think Mr. Trump will be the great leader, great commander in chief. Then it will hold everybody accountable.
Well, presumably that's why you've endorsed Donald Trump so wholeheartedly for this election. How have the people of your city reacted to your decision?
So I've been reaching out to a lot of people. A lot of people have been reaching out to me. Obviously you're not going to get backings from every person in the city, but the majority of the people that I talk to, people that reached out, and this community is not bashful. They'll reach out to you if they don't like something. And usually the people that like something, they don't respond, because they know things are going well. They don't respond, or they don't make their comments heard. But the people who are negative, the first to voice their opinion. But I can tell you a lot of people have been reaching out, a lot of positive feedback I'm getting. And I've been talking to even youth that just become of age to vote, 18 years old. They're very motivated, very supercharged, because they do have families overseas, and they're voting for Trump.
Now, other Muslim mayors from your region of the USA, including the mayor of Hamtramck, Amr Ghalib, have also endorsed Donald Trump. To what extent do you think this is a direct backlash because of the Biden-Harris policies towards the Israel-Gaza conflict?
Well, I can't speak for other mayors, but for me, that's one of the biggest contributor is I'm all about peace. I'm a person that grew up in the war. I was born in Lebanon. I was raised in Lebanon to about 12. We immigrated to the U.S. because of the war, because of the bombardment. I've seen the ugliness of the destruction, the death in the street. It was very, very traumatic, for a 12-year-old. And that's one of my biggest decisions. My biggest decision was that, to vote for Trump, because that killing and everything going on in the Middle East right now is giving a lot of people flashbacks to when they were like myself, when we lived in the Middle East. And a lot of kids, the 18-year-olds, they still have families over there. They coordinate with them. They visited their homeland, and they feel the same way. So that's very critical, to all of us while we make that decision. Like I said, I can't speak for other mayors or other leaders, but for me, that's my deciding factor, and that's why I went with Mr. Trump.
Now, obviously, I know what you'd like to happen, but in reality, who do you think will win Michigan State?
Well, I'm very confident Mr. Trump will win. I had two residents actually come in, and they just popped their heads and they told me, I mean, these are 19-year-old kids. They just came before college. They said, "Hey, we voted for Mr. Trump." I'm like, "Well, thank you." So, I mean, they didn't have to do that, but they came in just to tell me, to show support and solidarity. So that's all. I hear a lot of positive feedback about Mr. Trump, and I hear a lot of negative stuff about Harris administration and lack of anything. I haven't seen anything pop up, something positive that I can say, and my seat is nonpartisan, but in this case, I had to voice my opinion and also my support for President Trump to bring stability, peace to the world.
Now, considering how close things are in the polls between the two candidates, being realistic, who do you think will win the presidency?
President Trump.
What do you expect as a lasting legacy of these US elections for the people of Dearborn Heights?
I think it's going to be tough the first few weeks, because people have their sentiments. They care about one party over the other, the Green Party. But I think once the election's over, I'm very confident Mr. Trump will actually come out and will try to bring people back together, and people will see that he wants peace and he's trying to get this my city back together, so people can see it. Once they see results, then people are going to say, you know what, I didn't vote for him, but I should have voted, and I'm glad he's the president.
Now, considering the tensions in the country and the divisions, there are real fears that following the election, irrespective of the result, that things might spill over onto the streets. What fears do you have that might happen in Dearborn Heights?
Well, we have the people here. I mean, they're very civilized. If there's any chaos, it's gonna probably come from somewhere from the outside the city. But we are prepared as a city to handle anything. And we are monitoring the situation. We will be monitoring the polls to make sure that everybody has the freedom, their right to vote. And whatever happens, afterwards, we're taking precautions just to make sure that there's no any issue in our city. And we will be our police from both local, state, will be monitoring the situation. And my chief is also working with outside agencies to make sure that no issues will happen in my city or neighboring cities.
Mayor Bill Bazzi, thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
So we've heard the thoughts of an Arab-American mayor in the US. Next, we'll hear the thoughts of an Israeli hostage negotiator and campaigner for peace in Gaza, Gershon Baskin. Which of the two presidential candidates does he feel will offer the best chance of achieving a lasting peace in the region? Gershon Baskin, thank you. It's good to have you on the show. And the first issue to discuss has to be the US election, since there's increasing speculation about how the Israeli-Palestinian situation, particularly Israel's extensive military campaign, will be handled depending on who wins the election. What's your assessment, and how would a Harris presidency change the dynamic compared with another Trump presidency?
I'm not sure that the Harris presidency would be a lot different from the Biden presidency. She has made some statements recently about the importance of ending the war quickly, bringing back the hostages. But it's all a matter of weighing and balancing the issues within the American political arena. I think that Harris would be freer from the blind support of Israel that Biden has been known for his 50 years in politics, and Harris represents more of the minority groups and the younger voices in America, which are a lot more pro-Palestinian. I would hope that she would take a lead in moving us out of this war situation and into a genuine renewed peace process, which has to be based in the Middle East region, not another American-led process. But the Americans could do a tremendous amount if they would recognize the state of Palestine, along with the other 151 or 152 countries around the world that have done that so far. Now, that doesn't end the Israeli occupation, but it removes the veto from Israel on Palestinian statehood. And as someone who has spoken often about the two-state solution, it's time for the Americans to do something real about it, to make this two-state solution a real possibility for the Palestinian people.
Well, of course, right now, the election campaigning is not even looking that far ahead. And on the campaign trail, Donald Trump keeps promising he'll stop all conflicts, including those Israel has with Hamas and with Hezbollah. But when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian situation, how did he fare in his previous presidency, except perhaps infuriating the Arab world in December 2017 by recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moving the American embassy there?
He certainly did that, which infuriated the Arab world. He moved forward with the Abraham Accords, which, while it created a situation of peace agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco, they did throw the Palestinians under the bus. But it should also be noted that Trump's deal of the century that he put on the table was essentially a two-state solution. It allowed Israel to annex 30% of the West Bank, which was, of course, unacceptable to the Palestinians. But Trump did put out there the principle of the two-state solution, and because Netanyahu could not go against Trump, the Netanyahu regime at that time actually accepted it. So one could say, in retrospect, that there was an agreement for the first time of Netanyahu to accept the idea of a Palestinian state. Of course, that didn't go anywhere. The Arab world rejected it, and it was a bad plan to begin with. But the principle of two states was there. Now, Trump is totally unpredictable. So it's impossible to imagine what he might do, what he could do. And when he says this war has to end, it could be a blanket green light to Israel to continue bombing Lebanon and bombing Gaza and bombing the West Bank. Who knows what Trump would allow to be done?
Well, considering what you've said, and despite the major decision on Jerusalem, Arab Americans now seem to be backing Donald Trump for his presidential candidacy in far greater numbers than many might expect. Are you surprised, and why do you think that is?
Well, I'm surprised if American Arabs vote for Trump. I know that the big issue for a lot of American Arabs is that they may not vote at all, and that is a sense of vote for Trump. I can't understand how any American Arab could vote for Trump. He's a racist. He's against minority groups. He wants to throw unregistered immigrants in the United States out of the country. And I think that American Arabs, American Muslims will suffer from the racism of another Trump regime. We saw it in the past in one of his first policy decisions when he was president was the Islamic ban. The ban on Muslim entry into the United States. So I think that every American Arab should be very careful thinking about voting for Donald Trump. I think it endangers them. I think it endangers the Middle East. It endangers the world.
Well, it's interesting because going to that two-state solution thing, Donald Trump, contradicting his previous position, has more recently stated publicly that he doesn't want, or he doesn't see a two-state solution working. And that's getting him cheers, of course, from American Jewish and Christian leaders who support the idea of a greater Israel that effectively takes over the existing Palestinian territory. So how will that equation ever be balanced?
I can't be, because Donald Trump is unpredictable. He can say one thing one day and completely the opposite the next day, and no one questions him on it. We have no idea how he will act if he does re-enter the Oval Office. We see him cozy up to dictators around the world and go against the allies of the United States in Europe and around the world, against the Ukrainians in favor of the Russians. The man is unpredictable and dangerous.
How is he managing to woo the Arab American community? I mean, Donald Trump also recently wrote a letter to the Lebanese American community saying he would, quote, fix the problem caused by Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and stop the suffering and destruction in Lebanon. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how has that been able to convince Lebanese Americans that he's the one to vote for in this election?
I have no idea. You really have to ask them. I don't understand it at all. I think that he would give Israel the license to continue bombing Lebanon wherever Israel wants to continue the flyovers over Lebanon. Even if they go back to an agreement based on UN Security Resolution 1701, Israel is demanding the right to continue to enter Lebanon whenever they want, whenever they see fit, and to continue their flyovers, violating Lebanese sovereignty. And I think that Donald Trump would probably give Israel a green light to do all of that. So I would say to Lebanese Americans, beware. Know who you're voting for. Know what this man is capable of doing. Harris may not be the ideal candidate for Arab Americans, but she is a lot better because she's reasonable, she's logical, she's coherent, she's consistent, and I think she can be influenced to be a lot better friend to the Arab world, a lot better friend to the Palestinian people, to balance the relationship with the state of Israel in a way that will end up recognizing Palestinian right to self-determination. This is one of the things that she said at the Democratic National Convention, and it's a group of words put together that few American presidents have ever said before, that the Palestinian people must have the right to self-determination.
Now, Gershon, with your decades of working in trying to get this peace process move forward, you're, of course, very familiar with the Israel-Lebanon axis. And quite often, Iran is brought into that equation as backing Hezbollah and so on. And it's almost like now, painting that specter of Iran in all of this. So what are the consequences of Israel's continued military campaign there on the potential for a wider conflict that might draw in the U.S.? And is that even a factor being considered by American voters?
I don't think it's being considered by American voters, but it is still very dangerous, and the situation here is very tense with Iran. Iran attacked Israel with ballistic missiles at the beginning of last month. Fortunately, those missiles were shot out of the air by our neighbors, by the United States, by Israel itself, and there were no casualties from 181 ballistic missiles that were shot at Israel. The Israeli response was a measured response in that they didn't seek to hit civilian targets or the energy infrastructure or the nuclear targets. And as such, it could be a hold and wait period unless there's going to be another Iranian response. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei has said that there will be another response, but we don't know if that's empty words or there will be a response. This whole situation between Israel and Iran could be calmed down for the moment. But the most important thing is to get the war in Gaza over and to get the war in Lebanon over. That's what's inciting the rest of the region for a much more dangerous escalation.
Right, and perhaps the Arab American voters see that there is that prospect if Donald Trump wins, because he keeps saying he will stop all conflict. Now, what do you think would happen, Gershon, if Donald Trump wins and nothing changes? Would there actually be any consequences?
I can't predict. What I know is that the United States has to weigh heavily on Benjamin Netanyahu, on Prime Minister Netanyahu, to end the war in Gaza. This war must be ended. Look at all the damage that's been done in Gaza. 2 million people homeless now, over 40,000 people killed, thousands probably buried under rubble, still 101 Israeli hostages in Gaza. This all needs to end. Hamas needs to exit Gaza. There needs to be a civilian, technocratic, professional government taking over the Gaza Strip, perhaps the entire Palestinian Authority. We all need new leaders here. Netanyahu cannot continue as the leader of Israel, having the responsibility for what brought us to October 7th and what happened on October 7th and since then. And the Palestinians need new leaders. Mahmoud Abbas is in the 18th year of a 4-year term. He's 89 years old. The divided Palestinian leadership needs to be united. Palestinians need to have enough security and stability to be able to go to new elections. And this regardless of who is the next president of the United States. We need to make sure that this war is the last Israeli-Palestinian war. We need the help of the United States, regardless if it's going to be Harris or Trump, to enable us to do that. We need pressure from the United States on Israel to end its belief that the solution is military, because there are no military solutions here. And we need the United States to use its influence over Israel, because only the United States has enough influence over Israel to make Israel make a policy shift like that, with recognizing that there can be no military solution here. We need to get back to diplomacy and a political solution.
Well, that's an important point, Gershon. A key factor is whether or not Israel, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, would listen to Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, depending on whoever's in the White House, because there's been a broad consensus the Israeli Prime Minister has no issue with ignoring the requests of the US leader nowadays. And would that change with whoever's in power?
Well, I think it has to, and I think we have to recognize that Israel is more dependent on the United States today than ever before. I'm not a professional in the field, but I made a list of about 15 issues on which the United States has leverage over Israel. Now, some of these things are said behind closed doors. Some of them, when they're said out in the open, make Israeli politics shake. We call back to Henry Kissinger, who just used the word reassessment of American policy toward Israel. It shook up Israel. Or James Baker, when he was Secretary of State, who said, this is the phone number of the White House, call me when you want to talk to us. That shook up Israeli politics. It led to the election of Yitzhak Rabin and the throwing out of Yitzhak Shamir. So there are things that the Americans have. The doomsday weapon, which I don't think that they would use, is stopping to arm Israel entirely. But there are many things that the United States provides Israel with, including a political cover in international forums like the United Nations Security Council, which doesn't always have to be there. Now, we have a window of opportunity still from November 6th until January 20th, when President Biden can actually be, as a free agent, use the power of the presidency to apply pressure on Israel, on Netanyahu, to end this war. This is on the condition that Hamas puts a deal on the table that's acceptable, which is ending the war and bringing the Israeli soldiers out of Gaza, releasing an agreed number of Palestinian prisoners, releasing all the hostages from Gaza, and Hamas agreeing not to be the government in Gaza on the day after the war. Now, I know Hamas has told me that they're willing to do all of this. They need to make it official. They need to tell the mediators in Qatar and in Egypt that they're willing to put this deal on the table. And on November 6th, Joe Biden, regardless of who wins the election, is a free agent. And we've seen at least 2 American presidents in the past change their policy on Israel after Election Day. Barack Obama and even Ronald Reagan, who began a dialogue with the PLO after Election Day.
That's such an interesting perspective, Gershon, that there is that window of freedom for the outgoing US president. Really, it's the first time I've heard that. Now, just a quick thought as we wrap up. What's your sense of what the Israeli people themselves, and I sense there is some division, obviously, over the hostage situation, but what do you sense the Israeli people would like to see happen in the US?
Oh, the Israeli public is in favor of Donald Trump winning. This is for sure. It's really a strange situation. When you look at American Israelis, 3 out of American Israelis vote for Donald Trump. 3 out of 4 American Jews vote for Kamala Harris. There's such a division between Jewish Americans and Israeli Americans. And the Israeli public overall, there was a poll that was published just last night that showed something close to 70% of Israelis, all Israelis favoring Donald Trump over Kamala Harris. There's this image that Trump is more pro-Israel than Harris would be. I think it's a lot of spins and a lot of imaging and not real politics.
Gershon, you gave us a lot of food for thought there. Thank you very much. I look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you.
The ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine is another conflict that could hinge on the outcome of the US elections. During the presidential debate on TV, Donald Trump refused to say whether or not he wanted Ukraine to win, and instead he repeated his claim that he could settle the war in 24 hours. His rival Kamala Harris has spoken about continuing US support for Kyiv. To consider the consequences of the election on the war, my next guest is the former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele, whose dossier famously linked the 2016 Trump campaign with Russian electoral interference. He reveals more about that episode in his new book, Unredacted: Russia, Trump, and the Fight for Democracy. Christopher Steele, glad you could join the show. Let me start by asking you what you'd expect to be the likely consequence for the war in Ukraine under a Harris or a Trump presidency. Let's start with Kamala Harris.
I think they'll be quite profound. I think if Kamala Harris wins, I think the Americans will strengthen their support for Zelensky and the Ukrainian people in their resistance to Russian aggression, particularly given the deployment, we're told, of North Korean forces in a war on the European continent, which really is something out of George Orwell. Not even I would have predicted that that would happen. I think that if Trump wins, it'll all be different, that actually some sort of deal will be imposed on Ukraine, which will be very detrimental to the sovereignty and democracy of the country and its security. And indeed, that will have reverberations around the world in terms of defending and standing up to bullies and to international autocrats in places like Taiwan and the Balkans.
So when Donald Trump says he can settle the Ukraine war in a day, even if that was possible, how do you think he could achieve that?
Well, it's hyperbole, of course, from Trump, as everything is. But Trump's concept of how this war ends is in a deal with, well, between him effectively and Putin. And Putin is in a position now where he has done extremely badly in the war and has not achieved any of his initial aims, which is a big surprise to all of us. In fact, although Russia has definitely an advantage on the Donbass battlefield at the moment, which is one particular region, it's hardly really moved forward much since the initial period of the invasion in 2022. And the one way in which Putin can get off the hook here, having lost between, it's argued, 500 and 600,000 killed and wounded, which is astonishing numbers, sort of 30 times the size of what they lost in Afghanistan, is for Trump to be re-elected and for an isolationist foreign policy to come into force in Washington. And that, of course, doesn't just depend on Trump. It also depends on what happens in the elections to the Senate and the House of Representatives, which are also significant, I think, regarding Ukraine's future. Because any deal, in fact, even with Kamala Harris as the president, any deal to roll over US financial and military aid to Ukraine would depend on congressional approval.
And of course, in the background, we have NATO. How worried do you think NATO leaders might be about the outcome of this US election?
I think in general they're very apprehensive, but I suspect that the further east you go to countries like the Baltic states and Poland and Romania, there is particular anxiety about this because Russia won't stop at Ukraine. Putin may have to go back home and rearm and re-equip and everything his armed forces. But a bit like the 1930s, he'll be back if he prevails in Ukraine, and he'll back in terms of aggression towards the Baltic states, I would think, in the first instance, and possibly others. And the risk is that Trump will either leave NATO or he will make the Article 5 mutual defence guarantees much weaker and not reliable, and will encourage Putin on. So I think that is a great concern.
Well, early in the US presidential campaign, President Putin made a comment that he preferred Kamala Harris to win and liked her laugh. It was widely considered to be a joke, but in your opinion, which candidate would Vladimir Putin like to be in the White House next?
Almost certainly Donald Trump. And in fact, if you look at some of the things that have come out in this election campaign, the so-called Tenet media case, which you'll be aware of, where the Russians were caught pouring $10 million into an internet chat show or whatever in America, thoroughly behind Trump. And indeed the attempt a couple of weeks ago to smear the vice presidential candidate Tim Walz on the Democratic side with all sorts of smears and slurs about his private life, were clearly emanating from Moscow, and a sign that, in fact, the Russians are more than ever keen that Trump should win and that Republicans should win, and that America should adopt an isolationist and pragmatic, as it were, I would say mercantilist foreign policy.
Do you still believe Russia holds some kind of leverage over Donald Trump? And if so, what's the nature of that leverage?
I suspect that they do hold leverage over Trump. That leverage could vary from financial information to personal conduct information. I suspect that hasn't been fully investigated by the US security authorities, particularly when Trump was president. And it's something that there's clear evidence that this has been talked about, not just by our sources back in 2016, but by other people. If you look at the Mueller report, for example, there is a conversation there recorded between Michael Cohen, who was working for Trump at the time, and a Georgian Russian contact of his in Moscow about there being compromat sex tapes involving Trump. So I don't think this is unique to us. I think it's something that's out there and is still a big question mark.
From what you know of Vladimir Putin, which of the candidates do you believe could be the most effective in dealing with him?
Again, I think it's not just the presidency that matters in this regard. It also depends on who's running Congress, who are leading the key committees. Because, as I said, I think the key issue at the moment will be whether American aid to Ukraine, financial aid and military aid, is rolled over. And we saw how damaging it was earlier this year when there was a hiatus in the aid being provided to Ukraine because of stalling in the American Congress, and the fact that over half the Republican members of the House voted against this aid package. But I believe firmly that the way to deal with Putin is through close alliances with NATO, with the EU, with the European countries and other allies like Japan and Korea, South Korea, that is, Australia. And I think Vice President Harris would be much more effective in that regard than Trump.
Do you believe that Russia is still very actively trying to interfere in US elections?
I think certainly to an extent it is. There's always a trade-off in these situations between the desire of the Russians to get the political outcome that they want, which is a Republican Congress and a Republican Trump presidency, and the risk that will offend and make relations with the alternative candidate, Harris in this case, much worse if she were to win, plus the sort of almost paranoid wish to be undetected, to be unearthed as the source of this stuff, the deniability, the so-called plausible deniability that we talk about in my world is very important to Putin as a former KGB officer. So I think there are three things going on there. One will be their desire to get Trump elected and the Republicans into Congress. 2, their fear of Harris winning and taking revenge on them. And 3, the risk of being caught, which of course is connected with the second of those things.
Now, you became famous as the author of what's called the Steele dossier that explored Russian interference in US politics and the connections that Donald Trump had or didn't have in Russia that might have wanted to influence the US election outcome in 2016. From what I understand, that was essentially raw intelligence that was meant to be a guideline for a further investigation. So what were the consequences of that information going public?
Multiple consequences, I suppose. The most serious, I think, was the impact it had on the sources that were used in the reporting. And as I say in my book that came out recently in the United States, Unredacted, 2 of those sources we've never seen or heard of since. And I think in general, we know that all of the sources that were exposed or potentially exposed as a result of BuzzFeed's decision to publish the dossier almost unredacted was that they all come under tremendous pressure. And as a wider consequence of that, I think, a deterrence for any other sources in Russia to come forward, not only to us, but to also to Western governments and Western security and intelligence services to report on these issues, because it was clear that there was a risk that certainly the Republicans in the US Congress, the media and Trump might well expose them to retribution.
What's the chance that the facts will ever be fully uncovered?
It's a good question. I would say that we won't know the full truth of any of this. And it's broader than just Trump. It's also the truth behind the Litvinenko case, the Skripal case here in the UK, other cases of a similar sort. Won't happen until and unless the regime in Russia falls, that the Putin regime is expunged or is defeated. And that the files of the Russian security services become available to us. That is unlikely, but it's not entirely impossible. If you remember back in 1990 when East Germany collapsed and the Stasi files were made available, those that weren't destroyed, very interesting files that gave us a lot of detail, not just actually about what the East Germans were up to, but also what the Russians were up to, the Soviets were up to with them in East Germany at that time. And of course, ironically, one of the Soviet intelligence officers who was serving in Germany or in East Germany at that point was one other than Vladimir Putin.
Now, as you say, you've written a book, Unredacted, Russia, Trump and the Fight for Democracy, and in it you refer to what you describe as the dodgy dossier episode. How did it affect you personally?
I think it's had both a good and a bad effect on me. It's not something I would have sought would be the publicity and the fame or the infame surrounding it. But I think 2 things. One, it's profoundly affected the security of myself and my family and my colleagues and so on. We have to be a lot more careful in what we say and do. We are subject to very significant cyber attack, for example, most of the time, and in our movements. But I think on the other hand, it has enabled us to have a platform to be able to talk to the media, talk to the public. It's rare for people of my background to have that position or that ability, and to transmit a message, which is really one of warning that these countries like Russia and China, these autocracies, are determined to weaken the West and undermine our way of life. And sadly, the measures that we've taken against them so far have not been very effective.
What do you believe to be Vladimir Putin's end goal? Do you think he sees himself as a modern-day czar, as some commentators speculate?
I think he's an opportunist and more of a tactician actually than a strategist, and that's not untypical of an intelligence officer. And the other thing he tends to do is over-personalize international relations in looking at different leaders he meets and has interactions with. But I think his overall goal is obviously to consolidate his own corrupt wealth and that of his cronies, and the fact that they can transmit that wealth down to their children and their relatives and their mistresses and their wives and so on. But I think on a larger scale, and particularly in recent years, he's wanted to be someone whose legacy would be that he started to rebuild Russia's security space as was occupied by the Soviet Union by building out from the collapse as he sees it of Gorbachev's Russia, Gorbachev's Soviet Union, and playing a particularly crucial and central part in this, it's important to understand, is Ukraine, which he doesn't regard as having been a separate country at all or a separate people. And that's the fundamental problem when you come to discussing, for example, whether there can be any peace deal with Russia over Ukraine. Putin, it's important to understand, does not believe that Ukraine should exist as an independent entity, and probably thinks that at least 3/4 of it should be brought under Russian rule and Russian control, which is real anathema, of course, for those in Ukraine who have tasted some degree of freedom and the rule of law and other things in recent times.
Ultimately, how do you think Russia will come out of this current conflict with Ukraine, and what could precipitate a solution?
I think it's difficult to see any solution coming out of this that would be acceptable to Ukraine or the West, as long as Russia has the upper hand on the battlefield. I suspect that Russia will come out of this in the longer term very severely weakened and damaged. Russia was a power in decline anyway, economically and militarily, and in terms of its population and everything else, up at this point, and that has accelerated. Russia is vastly becoming a vassal state, really, of China. Putin has this fantasy, really, that he's equal partners with Xi Jinping and China, but he's not. And China will come to dominate Russia in times to come. And that will be very uncomfortable, I think, for Russia and Russian people who know that China is no friend of theirs and has, ambitions to expand its influence and its economy and its finances across the far east of Russia, which is a resource-rich area that the Chinese will need to draw upon in the future.
You've been part of the traditional intelligence services, and I wonder, in an age of AI, social media-based misinformation and disinformation, and partisan mainstream media, what real relevance does the work of the intelligence community have anymore?
I think it's hugely important, but not least for the reasons you're saying, because to have an intelligent, interactive human source who has access at the top of these regimes or near the top of these regimes is invaluable. And I've seen this so many times that an issue can be broken open by just one source, and it's hugely useful to the West. And of course, we saw it at the beginning of the Ukraine war, where clearly Western intelligence knew from its human sources in Moscow and elsewhere that this invasion was coming, it was going to be full scale, and was able to give the warning and prepare for it. Because autocracies rely upon surprise and shock to achieve their objectives. And I would say that that also applies to China's attitude and approach to Taiwan, for example, which will not be something that a journalist would be able to pick up on the streets or with their contacts. So I think that even signals intelligence, communications intelligence is not an interactive, intelligent way to go about it in the same way as human intelligence is, with all its flaws and its problems, is a vital part of our ability to understand particularly opaque autocratic regimes, and ones like Russia and China, in which the leadership itself is in the business of lying to each other and deceiving each other. It's a very complex business, and human intelligence helps to understand it better.
Christopher Steele, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
To many intelligence, security, and economic experts, China is by far the #1 threat to American interests, and yet it barely featured in the electoral campaign beyond discussions about Donald Trump's plans to impose tariffs on some Chinese imports. So why aren't the candidates focusing more on China, and who does Beijing want to win? Well, let's turn to a leading authority on such issues in the form of Martin Jacques, the author of the global bestseller, When China Rules the World. Martin, thank you for making the time for this. There's a lot to discuss. Now, we're comparing what we can expect from each of the candidates in their approach to China. Let's start with Kamala Harris. What's your opinion?
Well, I think that Kamala Harris, as far as China's concerned, will probably continue with the Biden approach, which is essentially, obviously, to see China as a rival, to continue to intensify the technological war against China, limiting American exports, seeking to prevent Chinese imports, and so on. And I think that will be very important. But more generally, I think that the characteristic of the Biden-Harris approach is to build alliance. The the attempt to isolate China or limit China rests on alliances in Europe, with Europe on one side, and of course in East Asia on the other, Japan, Korea, and so on.
Donald Trump is often considered a little volatile. So how do you feel things might change with him?
Well, he is. You're right. He is volatile. I think that Trump represents a significant shift. I mean, of course, we've got to remember that Trump was the first guy, the first president who started really the attacks on China and so on. But I think Trump's sort of strategy, his vision, is rather different in key respects to the Biden-Harris position, in that Trump does not believe in alliances in anything like the same way. So what you have with Trump is a shift away from the paradigm of American post-1945 policies, with its emphasis on the alliances, NATO, what used to be CETO, and so on, and a much greater emphasis on the United States. And so he above all, he wants to make America great again, but not through a set of alliances, but through the success of the United States itself. And that's a retreat, I think, from, well, that's a return in a way to a pre-Second World War vision of what America's place in the world should be. So, you know, that is America on its, more America as such, and much less dependent on alliances.
Now, Martin, you have a much better understanding than most people of how, you know, tricky that balance between China and America is in its interactions. I don't think a lot of people realize it's not as simple as the headlines that are presented, you know, simply with Chinese goods, for example. Considering those two perspectives you just gave, which of the candidates do you believe China would prefer to have in the White House?
Well, I think it'll probably vary amongst the Chinese experts and so on, and advisors. I think that, I mean, I certainly recognize and see some Chinese voices. I mean, for example, like Yan Shutong, who's a leading international relations scholar, emphasizing that probably China would, on balance, probably do better with Trump than with Harris, simply because it's, you know, Trump's got much less emphasis on alliances. Having said that, of course, Trump is very big on tariffs, and I think we can expect that to happen with a vengeance in a Trump administration. He's talked about 50% tariffs on China, 10 or 20% on other countries, and so on. Now, that's going to obviously constitute a serious problem for China, because China relies a lot on its exports to the United States. So I think that on balance, I would guess slightly favoring Trump in China, but I don't think they're, you know, I think they're ready for whatever happens, whoever wins and whatever they do. I think China won't be in the same situation it was after 2016, when really I think it did expect Clinton to win. It didn't expect Trump to win, and there was a period when it had to, I think, readjust its attitudes.
Well, Martin, policies aside, it does often come down to personalities. Now, which one of the current candidates would be more capable of dealing most effectively with President Xi Jinping?
Hey, I don't know. I think that Trump's approach, I think, last time, and I guess it might be the same again, was, a bit of carrot and the stick, or rather stick and the carrot, perhaps in that order, because he was very severe against China. I mean, this was a very new voice, after the Obama period. This is finally America in the form of Trump saying, China is a big threat to the United States, and I think that and then of course the carrot bit was, President Xi and I are very good friends. We get on very well together. We're old friends. You'll be old friends now, of course, and so on. So he's got that sort of Trump attitude. Harris, I don't know. I think it's difficult to say with Harris because we know so little about her even now, because she's not really been exposed to a great deal of scrutiny apart from during this brief period when she's been a candidate. So I think there's one other thing I should emphasize, though, generally. This is a general point to make, and that is America is really on the defensive in this relationship with China, because it's China that's been doing the rising and America that's been doing the declining. So I think all our discussions about this have to be framed within that context. Okay. That China's been doing very well over a long, extraordinarily well over a long period, and America is not. We can see this. America is not the power it was before.
Now, trade issues aside, of course, there will be the issues of geopolitical tensions that the next president will have to deal with. And I wonder what you think China will do, for example, about Taiwan. How likely is it to take some decisive action during the next US presidency? And if so, what would be the outcome?
Well, I don't think China will do anything rash. I don't think China will take military action and invade Taiwan. I think that it recognizes that would have all sorts of consequences, some predictable and the worst probably unpredictable. So I think that the talk in America, in Washington, D.C. about, they've given, she's impatient, he's given it a certain timetable. I don't agree with this. I don't believe this. They've waited a long time. So what's the big deal? They can wait longer than that. I think the only thing that would push them is if America formally recognizes Taiwan or as an independent country, or Taiwan declares, as it were, independence. I think then that would put the whole situation into a new context. Now, we should remember that when Trump first came into the presidency, he did wobble actually on Taiwan. He obviously was not really familiar with the issue, and he was quite provocative. And the Chinese, I think, were very concerned about this. But after that, Trump's attitude towards Taiwan, he sort of allowed things to more or less to proceed in the way they had previously.
One thing that a lot of people might be wondering is why the issue of China, considering this important relationship, has been so low in terms of visibility on the election campaign in the US.
I agree. I think that is interesting. And I think it does tell us something important about the nature of the divisions between the two candidates in the United States, or more generally, the sheer polarization of American politics, which is, during the Cold War, we never saw anything like that in America. America was basically as one in broad sense, from the late 1940s of the Cold War up to 2016. And now it's so polarized that even, what is regarded and is presented as the common enemy by Trump and by Harris is actually not been a major issue of contestation or argument, or we've got to do this or we've got to do that against China. I mean, China's there, they're saying the same kind of things, but it just hasn't had the same prominence. Why? Because America's so divided.
Now, you indicated that we have to remember China's been rising as America's been kind of declining. When it comes down to it, can either US presidential candidate do anything to prevent China becoming the dominant power on the world stage, or, as you put it, ruling the world, as you refer to it in your book? Is that just inevitable?
That was just the title. I might, sure. What I argued in my book that China was the rising power and would become the leading country in the world. And America, in this context, was in decline. And I see absolutely no reason to revise that view. I mean, everything that's happened since I published my book in 2009 has basically gone exactly along those lines. And one can see the extraordinary transformation of China. So no, I think that China, that process will continue, but it will hopefully it can continue in a world that remains peaceful.
Well, you did call the title of the book "When China Rules the World." So is that a scenario something the US should be worried about?
I mean, that is what America is worried about. The reason America shifted its position on China was its previous position had been that China would never be a threat to the United States. One, because it would have a dirty, great, big economic crisis. And that did happen, but it was in America, not in China, in 2008. And secondly, that its political system was not fit for purpose. And therefore, there would be a big political change in China, and it would become aligned with, as it were, Western-style democracies. And, that was a fundamentally misconceived position. And I did argue that in my book, that China is actually a very strong country. Its system is very, including its political system, is extremely well rooted, with a long history behind it, and so on. And that China, China would carry on. I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's a huge country. It's got 1.4 billion people. And, for those who forget these things and think China was as many, I remember when I was speaking about my book, someone in the audience would invariably say, but let's face it, China's a good copier, but it's not capable of invention and creativity. And I said, come on, look at its history. China's been extraordinarily good at that. And we're seeing that. China's making incredible progress. I mean, it's not, in my view, technologically yet on a par with the United States, but it's not far behind. And in some areas, it's ahead. That's been done in such a short space of time.
Well, Martin,
I mean, what I look forward to in the longer run is what I hope to see is a coming together of the United States and China on the basis of a recognition that this can only happen if the United States, instead of fighting against China, recognizes China's role, accepts that it can no longer be the sole hegemon in the world, but should share that with China. I think that would be the era I would look forward to out of all this present friction.
Well, Martin, I look forward to digging into your expertise on China in more detail on this show in the future. Thank you for the time on this and giving us the perspective on the US election. Talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
To complete our analysis, let's return to the US and hear from a Republican who was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, but won't be voting for Donald Trump. David Frum is a senior staff writer and editor for The Atlantic, and author of books including Trumpocalypse and Trumpocracy. Well, David, with voting underway and a result round the corner, what would we expect from a Harris administration and a second Trump presidency?
What you should expect from a Harris administration is balanced government, because there will be a Republican Senate, almost certainly, and very possibly a Republican House, too. She will have little leeway to do a lot of experiments. She will not be able to promote, unlike President Biden and President Obama, who both did big spending and taxing measures when they came into office, I doubt she'll be able to do anything like that. I think her big promise to the American people is to better protect women's rights, their autonomy, and their bodies. And I think that will be popular enough if she wins that she will be able to take some steps on that. That will probably be her major first initiative. A Trump administration begins by Trump trying to cancel all the legal actions against him by trying to pardon himself and the other January 6th co-conspirators. It begins with him abandoning Ukraine. And of course, these predatory trade actions that threaten the whole world trading system. Trump doesn't understand how tariffs work. He doesn't understand how damaging they are. And one of the things he keeps promising Americans, for example, is that Americans don't pay tariffs, foreigners do. Now, that's not true, but even suppose it were true. Okay, then the foreigners impose retaliatory tariffs. Who pays those? That some way, Americans are paying somehow. But what we're really in danger of, as the front page of the Financial Times warned just this week, of a spiral of narrowing trade, buying less from each other, less and less mutual benefit, less and less cooperative approaches to the global economy, more and more competitive and hostile approaches to the global economy. How is that good for anybody, Americans least of all?
David Trump, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And that's all for this special US election episode of the show. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.